A question that should be asked when talking about research-based teaching and learning is whether all students should become researchers, at least at a basic level. Here it is important to stress that not all programs necessarily have this explicit aspiration. While all courses can and should be research-based, not all subject areas are as strongly rooted in research as other subjects. Likewise, as I will show more clearly in another video, when the research literature talks about inquiry-based learning, it is often equated with research practices. The phases that the student goes through in their inquiry are largely the same phases that a researcher goes through when doing research. For this reason, inquiry-based learning is also perceived to be compatible with a research-based approach to learning. Thus, inquiry-based learning aims to create students who have insights into research and the ability to conduct research. So, where does this leave those areas of higher education that do not have the same explicit aim of fostering those kinds of research skills? To answer this question, it must first be noted that education can still be research-based, even if it does not explicitly aim to make students into researchers at a basic level. For example, if the teaching is based on research literature or is rooted in teaching practices verified as effective by research, then the teaching is research-based. I've talked about this before. I have a link to that lecture up here in the corner, so feel free to watch that lecture if you haven't done that yet. But to briefly summarize, according to Mick Healy's model, which you see here, and which is based on Ron Griffith's research, much in teaching and learning can be research-based. As I also asked the viewer to observe in that video, it is worth noting that only one category is described as research-based. However, I argue that all these elements are an expression of research-based teaching and learning. As I said, if you teach the latest research, as in the bottom left corner, then your teaching is research-based. If you have a students read and reflect on research literature or their own work, as in the top left corner, then your teaching is research-based. And if you teach about how knowledge is produced in your subject area, as in the bottom corner to the right, then your teaching is research-based. So although the purpose of the teaching of a subject area is not to create researchers, the teaching can be research-based anyway. Second, it is also worth mentioning that from a Swedish perspective at least, it is the norm that all students, regardless of their educational program, produce a final project of some kind, perhaps in the form of a dissertation or a thesis. This final work is usually also expected to follow certain established criteria that are compatible with a research-based perspective, in the sense that it is produced according to basic research principles and processes. The finished work therefore largely resembles a research articles, and sometimes they are even sufficiently well done to be published. Thus, although the ambition is not to train future researchers, students are introduced to the research process in a very concrete way, at least at the final stages of their studies. We can then say that they are in practice being trained to be researchers, even if that is not an outright goal that is mentioned in the program. Third, we can also think that all areas of teaching should aim to make students into inquirers, which is a fundamental characteristic of researchers. Indeed, if we return to Healy's model, we see that inquiry is what students should be expected to achieve. Thus, inquiry describes the level that places the most emphasis on research processes and problems, and the most emphasis on student participation. Inquiry-based learning helps students reach this level of learning, where students become independent inquirers. In relation to this, I would like to ask a question. What field of study does not want to train students to become independent inquirers? Let's say you don't want to train them to become researchers, but who would argue that they don't benefit from being inquirers? So my point is that if we change the question from should all students become researchers to should all students become independent inquirers, it becomes more obvious that the answer is yes, at least in a Swedish context. I will show that inquiry-based learning contributes to such a process, which we turn to in the next video.